Welcome to the National Gallery of the Cayman Islands. We're here in Grand Cayman at the Island Underground exhibition by Jawara Alleyne. This impressive, expansive and ambitious exhibition explores Jawara's process, contextualizing it within Caymanian art practices and then dialogue with the cultural artifacts that have inspired him. It presents the last three fashion collections, Beach Business, Eye of the Storm and Island Underground, presenting locally but with an awareness of your global perspective. I'm thrilled to be joined by Jawara himself and also Gareth Wrighton, art director of Dazed. Jawara, Gareth, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I wanted to start this kind of conversation actually to explore your guys' relationship, and because I think it's emblematic of a lot of what's at show here in Island Underground. Jawara, I guess I'll start with you.
So I've known Gareth since I moved to London, actually. And over the years, I think we've just developed a working relationship that's based a lot around our friendship, being two creatives within the industry that I think we see quite closely eye to eye. Like, there's a lot of interest that we have within the way that we think about fashion and the, I guess, past of fashion, the future of fashion, what fashion can be, what fashion represents. I think over the years, we've just developed a working relationship that we're always sort of like bouncing ideas off of each other.
I think it's the kind of quite a fluid London relationship that we have in like a wider network as well. And I think, you know, we kind of studied alongside each other at the same time, and then we were in the clubs at the same time, and we were kind of at the same after parties and talking about the same stuff. And it's like seeing, kind of taking stock of this exhibition, you can see a lot of those initial themes. You can see a lot of that language and a lot of that London kind of conversation happening. And I think as our professional careers have kind of developed, we've kept that language going exactly the same. And we've kind of formalized it in the way that you collaborate in the pages of our magazine and you're coming to me with like your show lineup. So I think it's like we've really kind of formalized it as we've formalized our professional careers as well.
It's a very dynamic, collaborative framework, and I think that feels that it creates really new and unexpected things, and I feel that that is represented throughout this whole exhibition. It's this kind of the dynamic forces of creation that you don't so much structure in your work as you allow them to kind of come together quite naturally. And when you were thinking about putting this exhibition here together in the Cayman Islands, what was the initial kind of approach, like the first idea of when you had this opportunity to take over this amazing space?
Before thinking about the exhibition itself, I kind of structured around the concept, sort of around this idea of identity. I was really interested in using, at that point, the collection that had finished my moment of fashionista was The New World. It was about storytelling, and it was about the way that within the Caribbean, a lot of times we're not really in charge of telling our own story to the world within a global space. Our story, in so many instances of history, is a story about us being told to us. And that New World collection was kind of about that storytelling. And I titled it New World because I remember when I was in school, we would always learn about Caribbean history from that moment called the New World, when Christopher Columbus came to the islands and la 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 la. We sort of see that was the beginning of a story, even though our story didn't really start there. So for me, like, the New World was about reclaiming and reinvestigating how I tell stories about who I am, about the people that I grew up around. So that collection went into Beach Business, which was looking at the idea of coming from an island like the Cayman Islands and what that looks like, because Cayman is a very island kind of island where, you know, you drive around the coast and it's just beautiful beach. You couldn't feel more in an island. Yet the corporate space has this really interesting tension between the relaxation of being on an island, but then living in a culture that is very corporate and work heavy, and almost like there's a uniformity to it. So then there was that collection that went into Eye of the Storm, which discussed themes of the hurricane, and then it kind of culminated in Island Underground, which encapsulated, I guess, the language that I wanted to have my work sort of sit within. It was really interesting discussing how I can use the language of fashion to give something back to the community, essentially. I've always been asked to come back to the islands to do a fashion show, and I always kind of resisted that because it doesn't really help anybody. You know, it would only be a sort of ego trip to do a fashion show here at that current point in time. So I was always seeking for a way to allow the community to engage with my work in a way that felt a little bit more honest and give space for, I think, the themes that exist within the work that I'm doing.
And I'm really interested in this idea of kind of triptych or trilogy that you get through the storytelling and through the progression physically through the gallery and through those collections. And I wonder, like, what brings you into this mode of storytelling, and what do you feel, you know, and actually also in your in your collaborative work as well, like these dialogues and these stories, how do they exemplify themselves as 3 distinct chapters?
Honestly, the triptych kind of started with Fashionista, in that being a sort of incubator for how I can expand storytelling. So my work, and I feel like the collection from the MA, it's just been one big body of work. It's like one collection that just leads into the next one and picks up from the other one. And it kind of is a continuous thing. And doing this within the context of Fashion East kind of gave me a way to think about how I can expand one story over 3 seasons, as opposed to using one season to tell one story and then moving on to a completely different thing. Within the industry, fashion is very sort of, you sensationalize a singular moment, and once you do that show, then you have to move on to the next thing, and the next thing has to be something completely different to the last thing. So in this thinking of this idea of the triptych, the trilogy, and how I can sort of tell different sides of a collection. So you start with one, and then the middle kind of explores the territory, and then you conclude. I think it gave me a little bit more space to explore and to sort of expand the narrative over 3 collections.
It's like a 3-act structure.
Yeah.
And I think that's something you kind of get where you use, you know, at the beginning you're presenting quite raw ideas, research quite raw, and you're kind of setting a scene. And then you consolidate that 6 months later, and you can kind of have the action, and then you resolve it 6 months after that. And I think it's quite interesting to kind of weaponize that seasonality structure, but for another kind of storytelling.
Yeah, I mean, I've been getting asked quite a bit in interviews about whether or not presenting seasonal collections is a problem. Because I think we have this dialogue within the industry of what are the seasons for, and how does that actually help young designers? And for me, I think the seasons are actually kind of helpful, but it depends on how you approach it. How do you use those seasons to tell a narrative and to expand the story? But I think it's just fascinating to find different ways of using the structure that exists, rather than kind of trying to upend the entire system, but find different ways of using the system that's there, but to do something different within that system, and find ways of creating space that gives time for something new to come out of what exists before. Because I don't always think that you need to completely destroy everything in order to create something new.
The kind of very real thing that seasonality is helpful for a young designer is that journalists are there, and there's a point in time where you can see the work in real life, and you can be part of the schedule in that way. But as well, like, what's shown in the exhibition is how you work beyond seasons, through editorials, through custom, through red carpet, through celebrity commissions. And I think that you kind of represent a young generation that kind of doesn't march to that beat as well.
Yeah, there's a cycling. There's a cycle that sort of the work goes through, where there isn't a start and an end. It's just constantly, it's like the Ouroboros, you know, the snake eating its own tail, and it's just continuing to sort of evolve.
But those stops, as you say, in the seasons also allow, I mean, it's iterated, you know, it helps structure this exhibition, but also, you know, we speak about fashion as a language and a practice that iterates and builds knowledge. And I think that is one of, as you say, to usurp that framework, to actually explore, you know, the 6-month seasonality, to use it to get, as you say, focus everyone's attention, bring them in. But now we're in Grand Cayman, and actually bringing that here and kind of almost subverting that framework by putting process halfway through this exhibition, for example, and kind of, you know, creating these interventions in the seasonality, I think is really successful in exploring what it means to be a designer outside, or not outside of, but between multiple spaces. And I wanted to speak a bit about that process for him, and what you kind of what your aims with that space was as well.
I guess one of the aims with that space was addressing this idea, or I guess the reality of fashion, where you engage with the final product, but it's very rare that you get to engage with the process. Especially here on island, where there's a building understanding of fashion as a medium, not just as something that not just as clothes that you wear, but as a medium of expressing. But it's very rare that you get to see how you arrive at those conclusions, how you're using culture, how you're using inspirations. I think this is not just an island thing as well. I think it's just a overarching dialogue of the creative industry, especially as you have so many new young talent entering into the industry. I think the way that I use culture and break down culture within my work and within my practice, I think there's something that is very interesting there. And I wanted to find a way to propose and present this kind of world building that isn't based on singular stories, but it's building an entire world over a series of different engagements, whether it's editorial in a magazine, and how can you tell a story there that sort of links back to a collection from 2 or 3 seasons ago. Yeah, I think that there's something very interesting about expanding on that process and showing how much work actually goes into creating a final collection of 8 to 10 looks or 15 to 20. There's just hours and hours and hours of trying things and testings and fittings, and that's stuff that people don't normally see. And I think as well as you have so many new designers entering into the space, there's been such a glorification of the job of design where you're just so eager to get to the final product. But within that process, there's so much possibility. And I think that I'm a kind of designer that I'm asking questions, I'm never proposing answers. It's up to you to come to those conclusions. And I think that process room is really important, because this is where I think most of the creative work exists. It's like, there's the process of editing down the collection, but before you edit down the collection, there's just so many ideas that are just circulating around each other, and then you kind of have to figure out, okay, within this 10-look collection, what story are we actually going to tell?
That process room is seriously like quite an intimate part of like the process, which fashion audiences, you don't see it, you don't really get contact with the designer beyond like their final bow at the end of the show. And I think to kind of share that process is also really beneficial for like the educational portion of this like whole endeavor, because I think for any kind of young person who wants to do fashion, you won't see that process until you're kind of doing a placement at a major house or at a young designer. You're seeing like the fitting pictures, and then if you're kind of really canny, you're seeing the difference between the fitting picture and the runway picture,
right? And
you can kind of connect the dot of how it's evolved even in that one day since. And I always think there's this analogy. It's like when you write a script, or when you make a film 3 times. When you write the script, when you shoot it, and then when you edit it.
Right.
And each of those stages is another chance to completely flip the story and tell your own story. Yeah. You could take the garments in here and you could put on 100 different shows.
Oh, of course.
Because it's got that malleability, and it's the same thing in our magazine. And without your editorials, you could put pictures the other way around, and it means something else. And I think that's something that's kind of really brought across here.
And that's something I love about how both of you work, is this kind of the engagement with the kind of critical aspects of what it means to build knowledge, build culture, iterate images. And Gareth, I wanted to kind of explore that, because Dazed obviously is a magazine, but it is a cultural institution as well. And how, actually both of you, how aware do you let yourselves be in the moment of creation? Do you kind of block it all out, or is it kind of allowing these kind of different spheres of influence to really kind of permeate the work and those different pressures, I guess?
I think our role, it's, as like, we kind of call ourselves the National Geographic of youth culture. And I think that kind of represents the collective group of work as well, in which I think you fit so kind of vividly. I think it's always about telling stories visually. I think, having that limitation, trying to understand like the story we're trying to tell with whatever means we have to do it. That's half the fun of it. Again, that's like writing the script, and then again you shoot it and it becomes something completely different. There's also only so much you can kind of plan. You kind of set the right parameter, you book the right team, and then you kind of let them bring you the journalism by the end of it as well.
Yeah, I think there's something really interesting to be said about the giving yourself a parameter for what you think the outcome needs to be, but allowing space between that and within that for just magic to happen. Because I think that is the value of wanting to enter into this space of creativity and having a now job. But before there was the job, there was just the interest in all of that possibility. And I think that for me, whenever I'm creating the collections, I never really know what it's going to be until the very end. And it's only when it actually happens, usually on the day of the show, that I'm like, it all clicks and it all makes sense. You know, I think, especially with my practice where everything is kind of up for moving, you know, until the very last minute when I actually set it. But even beyond that, actually, the garments evolve and the garments change. You know, this use of safety pins just allows for never ending amount of potential, which I think is really exciting. I think that's one of the reasons why I'm so invested in the use of safety pins, because it is that question of something not being permanent and the ability of moving things around and resizing things and redraping things. And I think I'm always just proposing an idea of something that's up for interpretation, and it is possible to change this after, you know, this moment in time.
I'm really glad you brought up the safety pins, because they're, you know, the iconography of them has their kind of perceived connections to punk, which I know is incredibly important to you. But also what they do is they question the very kind of, again, framework, but borders of clothes, like the very stitches that hold us together, whether it be the actual pieces of clothing or maybe kind of more metaphysically between people. And you're really proposing different ways of looking at things and saying, okay, well, maybe this isn't forever, and that's okay. And if we let go of that need to freeze and to make things static and understandable, what kind of comes out? And again, I want to ask, how aware are you of all of this? You know, you say that it kind of comes like in a flash of the day of the show, and then do you lose it again and have to go find it for the next collection? Like how does this process iterate itself?
I'm not really sure. I just go with what feels right. I think that this is where the art side of my practice comes in, because fashion really asks you to know the answer. Whereas art, it is about what feels right. Like there is no right or wrong answer when you're painting paintings. Like what feels right. I think when I started really exploring this idea of the safety pin and the use of the safety pin and that possibility for just a space of potential, it's something that I kind of knowingly engaged with, but kind of always, I guess, allowed for things that I don't know, questions that I don't know to come up within that process. Yeah, I'm not really sure. I think that this, when it comes to sort of that use of presenting that idea of impermanence and presenting that idea of questions that I might not know the answer to as it pertains to the artistry within actually the drape, it's something that's just always happening. I think because also the work that I'm creating is not so much product led, but more emotion led. You're always on that journey. You're always on the journey. You find it in a moment on a particular day, whether it's at a shoot or at the show. But it's always a journey and it's always evolving.
I mean, the second collection of the trilogy is called Eye of the Storm, and you keep going like this. And Gareth, we've spoken about this kind of almost, you're not aware of the whirlwind around you when you're creating, but actually things are constantly moving, bumping into each other, creating kind of different collisions. And I think that's really present downstairs. But as we go upstairs into the exhibition, we kind of go into the National Archives and look at kind of Caymanian art practices through time. And what you've intervened there is you've highlighted from the collection pieces that have been inspirational to you, kind of foundational to you, and then you kind of revisit. And again, I wanted to ask you why you felt that was important to layer this trilogy then with the National Cayman Archives.
Well, I started my journey in fashion working with cultural institutions on the island. And one of them was the National Cultural Foundation. I did my first shows there, and there was always a question of heritage within these shows, which I didn't like at the time. Because when I was looking at the designers that I was inspired by in London, in Europe, looking at Carl, looking at Albert, Alexander McQueen, Margiela, I was like, these are not the themes that these guys are exploring. They're not talking about culture and heritage. Why do we have to do this? Why do I have to do this? But, I think my interest in art always kind of came naturally. It was not something that I had to think about. And whereas my interest in fashion was something that I had to think about, because you had to survey the people that are doing it within the industry and the people that you're inspired by, and look at how they're approaching fashion and what is it that they're breaking down, what is it that they're doing. Carl presented so many black garments, and I was just so interested in that idea of the concept is just always black, it's just always a black jacket, but every time there's a sort of new way of thinking about that black jacket. So I was looking at those rules of how those designers were approaching fashion, while thinking that, okay, I'm on island now, I'm still just learning and developing and growing, so I have to do these cultural engagements, but that's just something that is based on the fact that I'm doing fashion here. And over the years, I've just naturally gravitated towards art and expression. I think once I got to London, that practice of just being inspired by and looking at culture, it just kind of always came up in this way that I actively tried to not do it, but it always just did it by itself because that's just what came naturally to me. So now that we're doing sort of coming back to this exhibition, for me, it was really important to show how over the years I've looked at these artists and the way that they approach, very much the same that I was doing when I was surveying fashion back in the day, looking at the practice of art and the approach to materialism and the way that they're treating and using identity within their work and reflecting that in materialism, which has had such a huge impact on my work. Just because this is the place that I started my journey in engaging with art and fashion as a practice. So I think it was really important for me to highlight how there's so many works within the National Archive that really solidify my practice in a way that is not just me inventing something that is new. Yes, there is that, but there's so many other layers of artists before me that were exploring with materialism, and I think that gave me a framework to think about how I can approach fashion from a different language. It didn't really come from surveying fashion designers, it came from surveying artists and looking at how they approach materialism, and I think that really seeps into my work and has given me a really interesting approach to fashion that I think not a lot of designers have. I think, there were few designers that really treated materials in this way. And I really wanted to highlight where that came from.
It's like fashion that's quite led by instinct and not, which is fab at the early stages, right? Because there's so much freedom there.
Yeah.
And I think you're just kind of doubling down, tripling down on that. The more your kind of work is becoming like notorious in London, and then to kind of, to see these clothes in runway form in London and see how they've been brought back here, but in kind of static, put on a pedestal in this way, I think they really do sing. They honor that instinct-led practice, I think, really, really well.
And this kind of, this global perspective and language that your brand is building and proliferating all over the world, it's been an incredible 2 years that you're building on now, but to kind of root it in the kind of, the intuitive nature of Caymanian art practices, I think is, again, just layers in these sensibilities, and to present that here and not, in say London we had a fashion show, but here we're presenting art, and then also layer that in with the National Gallery supporting fashion as an art practice, which not all institutions do or can do. As culture and creativity and identity gets so kind of mammoth to explore, Gareth, I wondered how you find it again as a kind of cultural institution and surveying what's going on, kind of, pulling all these disparate parts together to form even a representation or a discussion of identity.
Yeah, it's like you're pulling all these parts together and you're going to like young lenses and, up and coming image makers to kind of do a commentary of the time. But then the second you send it to print or put it online, it just becomes another product of its time. And it becomes analyzed like that as well. It's kind of overwhelming. Like it's such an image-based society, which I think you really capture in the process room as well. Like I always kind of think about this kind of burnout. We see more images in a day than you're meant to see in your whole life, really. Like biologically, we're really overwhelmed. It's like an incredible industry to be in 2024 and to try and navigate,
Completely. I mean, I think there is something about bringing it, again, locally back here. And, Jawara, you've really engaged with the fact that you are of a generation. You have the room of Bendel Hines where you're responding to the generation before you's work, and then also inviting in the generation after you, and aware of this kind of temporality of, creativity, but also of iterating national identity as well. And again, how present is that for you when you're putting this collection together or these collections and this show together, about the fact it is being presented in Grand Cayman?
For this 3 collections, that was very present. You know, I was really thinking about how to capture the idea of identity and Caymanian identity within the collection, whether it was through the use of fabric, the colors, the types of fabric that I was gravitating towards. Also just finding ways of telling that story, but from my point of view, like building a Caymanian identity, but not, I think what happens a lot is with Caymanian, but with just Caribbean identity in general, when you see it on a global stage, it's always hitting the same notes of like pulling those few iconographic images that we're used to being seen, and sort of when you think about Caribbean identity being presented, it's in many ways always just hitting on those same notes when there's so many different things, there's so many layers there that can be explored. And I really wanted to find ways of building what feels Caribbean to me, because I think what happens a lot as well is that you start to come to the point where you start to doubt your own point of view, because if I'm presenting something that for me is Caribbean, does other people read it as Caribbean? You know, does other Caribbean people read it as Caribbean? And I wanted to be able to present work that I think Caribbean people themselves can allow themselves to question what is Caribbean for them. Because that's the way that I approach my practice. You know, I'm always trying to create something that for me feels like an image that I've never seen before, but it feels like me. It sort of like makes sense that, you know, this image of whether it's a gray skirt or a slashed dress, it just feels so Caribbean, but it's not a Caribbean the way that we've seen the Caribbean before. So I think this last 3 collections, and I think all of my work is trying to do that. It's trying to find ways of telling stories that feel familiar, but not in the way that we've seen them before.
It's like almost a transcendent form of identity. Like you're kind of projecting forward what it could be, and in that process, you're taking the next step. And then, Gareth, when you're receiving and working so closely with such large critical projects, how do you find kind of melding them into other stories as well? Because you're so open source, and you want these clothes to speak of everything that you speak of, and you also offer them out for other people to explore and iterate their own ideas. And I'm interested in that kind of not process between the two of you, but the process between the garments you create and then how you meld them into larger narratives or exemplify those.
I think again, it speaks to the vulnerability where it's like you can control your practice only so much, and things can be on your term as a designer, and that's sacred. But then the nature of the industry, the second you start collaborating and sharing, it becomes kind of vulnerable, and it becomes, you're working with other people's visions and other people's kind of agendas and narratives. But I think as well, it goes back to this idea that the clothes are kind of in flux. The clothes are fluid. The nature of the pin, the nature of it being, the nature of even like jersey as like quite a primary material for you. Like these pieces fit on bodies and they become something different on everyone who puts it on at a different time. And I kind of love that. And I love that you do you leave it to a talented team, and a shot comes back and it's been kind of, the garment has been painted in another way, it's been stretched, it's been draped. Again, it just kind of, it's that the garment's in flux always. And I think, again, this exhibition's like an example of it's on your terms, and it's been kind of curated brilliantly, and you've kind of let the team find a narrative in it. But I think, you've been able to control, this is kind of the Jawara way of a garment.
Yeah, I think there's something interesting in the way that I started my practice in London, because I was surrounded by incredible stylists. And I mean, I styled as well in the beginning of my practice there. And I was always interested in creating propositions for options, because I've been on those sets, I've been on those shoots, I've been the person styling where you might get a garment and it could work, but there's just something about it that's a little bit off. And there was just something that I found to be interesting about sending garments out that allowed you to builds, like you allow you as the team on set to build narrative for yourself rather than me saying, okay, this is the look, this is how I designed it, you have to shoot it like this. Because, you know, when you're on those shoots, there's something that's quite natural about that storytelling where you're pulling options, and on that day you want to have enough things that you can play with. And I think having garments that allows you to play with it, I think there's something quite exciting about that. And also it allows me to get things back that might have been, it's actually a part of the practice where, you know, you send garments out and the image that comes back is not necessarily exactly as you designed it, but there's something quite interesting about seeing how other people relate to the work and how other people drape the work and how other hands, you know, play with it.
Something I would really think about your stuff is like the hanger appeal of your garment is it couldn't be more different to the piece, like on a body.
Yeah.
And I think like these doorways look like your rail on a show. Like it really is like this kind of beautiful just strips of jersey.
Yeah.
And that I think is like the Jawara hanger appeal. The second it's on a body, it's just like kind of sublime and sexy.
It's also kind of breaking down the drape. You know, so my practice, I think, has two legs. There is the investigation in the drape, and then there's the investigation in identity and circularity. And when I started my journey in design when I was a kid, like the drape was always it was just a thing that came naturally because the garments that we wear in the island, they have to be super light, super flowy. So all the dresses were just nice, great, beautiful flowing dresses. But there's a relationship that I always had with fabric that I was always so fascinated by the way that different fabrics draped. And then when I went to London and kind of going through fashion school and thinking about fashion practices and the way that different designers built different practices based on what their specific research was. Like Albert at L'Enfant was very much about draping a very specific type of fabric that moved in a very specific type of way versus the drape that comes in Alexander McQueen's tailoring. You know, that's a very different kind of drape. And I was really interested in this idea of the drape and how you can deconstruct the idea of what that drape, how that drape can function and how that drape can speak to a different way of a different hand, you know, because as well, I think a lot of when you think about the drape, you think about the Greeks, and that's kind of like the pinnacle of the drape. But there's so many cultures around the world that actively work with drape in a different kind of way. You know, the Africans, they're constantly, it's a practice that they're using now where, you know, they just have a big strip of fabric and that's their Sunday dress, and then they drape it in the morning, and you can't drape better than them. You know, I think there's something really interesting about sort of breaking down that practice.
And it's kind of crucial to be presenting that kind of fashion in a place like London, because I think you are kind of notorious on that London schedule now for challenging like the typical fashion supply chain, that typical fashion like journey that I think a lot of young designers and really established designers in London adhere to. But what you're doing is global. It's actually an older form of dressmaking that when it's put in your hands, it's actually really kind of like deftly contemporary. And yeah.
No, completely. There's kind of these influx of dialogues between you and your references, you and the industry, you know, London and Cayman, you know, art historical practices, fashion canons, they all kind of come together and they never resolve. They're just always going back and forth. And, you know, I think the fashion shows allow a structure for us to come together and perceive the work. But for you, it's a constant practice, and I think that's captured here so beautifully in this exhibition, is this constant practice, these constant dialogues that layer and layer. They never kind of convene fully, but they contextualize each other. And yeah, I mean, it's so exciting and I think important to also be aware of the critical element and bring that in for the next generation of Caymanian creatives and Caribbean creatives as we move into, you know, a global world, you know. And there is, as you say, there's so many historical art practices that have been ignored or not present and rejected by the canon, and you stand in a place of hybridity to question, and I think that's so felt here. So Thank you both so much for your time. It's been a pleasure to be here. And yeah, congratulations.